Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church. Our forums are free and open to the public. We would welcome your attendance. For more information about our forums, go to our website at www.austinuu.org. This morning, I am very excited and honored to introduce Dr. Ricardo Ainslie, who will be speaking on the fight to save Juarez, life in the heart of Mexico's drug war. And he's going to be talking about his 3.5 years researching and writing his recently published book on Juarez during the time period 2008 to 2011. And as you know, Juarez was at the epicenter of the Mexican drug war. He's going to discuss the whole process of developing the book, interviewing various people who were informants, the challenges he faced, and the book's 4 main characters. And he's going to bring us up to date on the current situation in Juarez in Mexico. Just very briefly, because I have to condense his bio and his many accomplishments. He's a psychologist, psychoanalyst, who teaches at UT, but who uses books, documentary films, and photographic exhibits to capture and depict subjects of social and cultural interest. He has a number of books that he's written. He's received various awards for his work. He was inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters in 2006, and he became a Guggenheim Fellow in 2010 and was awarded a Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center residency. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Ricardo Ainslie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, and I'm delighted to be back. This is, I think, my 3rd visit to you all, so it's always a pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to interact with you and have interesting conversations. So the project that I'm going to talk about with you today is the book, The Fight to Save Juarez. And I thought, a year ago I spoke here and I talked more about the overall picture of what's going on in Mexico and what's been going on and what the roots of that are and so on. And I thought I could give a brief overview to kind of set the context for Juarez. But then I thought I would spend more time sort of talking about the process of working and developing this book, how I engaged this community, what the process was like, how I ended up with the 4 characters that are sort of the key figures in the book, and any questions you might have about the nuts and bolts of how one goes about putting something like this together, which is a complex process. Juarez is a city of 1.3 to 1.5 million people, probably about the size of Greater Austin, maybe a little bit smaller. And so to go into a community like that, not knowing anyone, and to try to find out what the narrative threads are that can help you begin to grasp what's going on in a city that's being eviscerated by the violence. It's an interesting challenge. So, but just to begin, as I know you all know, Mexico over the last 6-8 years has been overwhelmed by unprecedented levels of violence. Unprecedented at least since the Mexican Revolution that began in 1910. The level of bloodshed in some of the Mexican communities truly is of that magnitude. Although there's a kind of a weird paradox here, because there are also broad swaths of Mexico where, people aren't really living the violence. And, I was just in Mexico Mexico City last summer, which is my hometown. That's where I grew up, and I was asked recently, a few minutes ago, what interested me in doing this project, and part of the answer is that is that I'm from Mexico. I'm a Mexican citizen. I've always been, even though I came to the United States when I was 17 to go to college, and I still have friends, family in Mexico, and so on. So the things that go on in Mexico have always been of interest to me. But so that's really what motivated the book. I have done other work related to Mexico. I did a documentary film on how Mexicans view immigration in 2004, and in 2007 I did a documentary film about the wave of kidnappings that had swept through Mexico. So I do have sort of a history of doing projects in Mexico over the last 8 or 9 years. So this violence that's taken over Mexico, obviously we know the sort of the short answer, the headline answer, which is that there's the cartels have taken over significant portions of the country, especially the border areas. I'd say 6 to 7, maybe 8 states have really significant substantive cartel activity, presence, and in some of those states, the cartels could be considered to basically be running everything in those states. They're kind of ungovernable areas, like Tamaulipas, like some areas of Chihuahua, where really people live without any sort of protection from any sort of law enforcement, and where people are constantly being victimized by the violence. And when I say the violence, I don't only mean the cartel violence. I mean the sort of the derivative violence that comes from crime at the level of communities, gangs in neighborhoods, and so on. There's a kind of a lawlessness in those areas that is affecting everybody. I mean, there are people who are selling juices from push carts who have to pay extortion fees to local crime groups. There are people who own pharmacies and people who own hardware stores and whatever kind of business you have in some of these areas, especially in Tamaulipas and Nuevo León and Chihuahua. All of those states have a lot of extortions that are organized crime related. Some of that is at the end of the food chain is cartel run, and some of it is just local gangs. So it's a really complex story to really start understanding the violence. So in 2006, December 2006, Mexican newly elected President Felipe Calderón decides he's going to declare war against these cartels. That's his opening gambit within weeks of taking the presidency. And he declares this war by going to a military garrison. He dons a military jacket. He's in front of elite troops of the Mexican army, and he says, "We are going after the cartels, and we're going to take back this territory that has basically been lost to organized crime now for a number of years." There are several problems with this strategy, and that strategy and those flaws have really become apparent, once this strategy is deployed. And the main flaw is this. There are no resources that Calderón has available to manage this war. There are states like Chihuahua where the municipal police and the state police are run by the cartels. That's true in Chihuahua, that's true in Tamaulipas, that's true in other border states, Baja California. So all of those areas, it's not like, if there were some issue going on here in Texas, the president might call the governor and say, we need the state police and the municipal Austin City APD to come in and help us take care of this problem. You don't have that because you have police forces at the local and state levels that aren't interested in the organized crime drug cartel issue because they are literally the armed wing of those cartels. So he doesn't have those tools. The federal police, which would be the only other apparent option is only about 7,000 or 8,000 people nationwide. So you've got these people spread all over the country, and they are not a force that can be used. So the only thing that he has available is the army. The Mexican army has no experience, no training in any kind of law enforcement action. They are not people who come in and are thinking about people's civil rights. They come into communities, and if they see somebody who looks suspicious to them, they go into the house, they break down the door, they search and do whatever they want. They grab people, they take them, they sometimes beat them up, they sometimes torture them, and sometimes people die in their hands. So this is the instrument, a very blunt and a very problematic instrument that's deployed by the Calderon government, because there are no other tools to carry out this war. There are immediate consequences to that, which is all of a sudden you have an explosion in civil rights, human rights violations, and so on and so forth. So that's the problem. But some would argue, and many in Mexico argue, that at the same time there was no alternative given the degree to which the cartels were entrenched in these 6 to 7 states. Be that as it may, Juarez is a different story, because what happens in Juarez is that in 2008, there's a conflict between the two main cartels at the time in Mexico. One is the Juarez cartel, which historically had been the most powerful cartel in the country. Beginning in the 90s, the Juarez cartel was head and shoulders above any of the other cartels. They had the most people, they were running the most drugs, they were the most powerful. And by any analysis, they had the most influence in terms of government officials and corruption and so on. So what happens is that for a variety of reasons, the Juarez cartel becomes weakened. The main reason is that their leader dies in a surgery, a plastic surgery, when he's trying to change his face so that he won't. The DEA is pressing for his arrest. He dies in that surgery. His name is Amado Carrillo Fuentes. Within a couple of months, all of the surgeons involved in that operation are dead, by the way. And his brother takes over the cartel, and his brother is an absolute sociopath, psychopath. He's a very violent, very impulsive guy. Unlike Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who had made alliances with the different cartels, Amado Carrillo Fuentes would allow the other cartels to run their drugs through Juarez. He would protect their shipments. He would charge them, 10 or 15% tax. He would even help them get their product across the river for a fee and so on. There was a kind of an understanding among the major cartels during the 90s. But when Vicente Carrillo Fuentes takes over the Juarez cartel, he really starts breaking those agreements. He's just an impulsive, irascible guy. And so he starts seizing people's shipments. He starts killing. He killed the son of El Chapo, stuff like this. So the relationships that had been the mafioso peace that had been the governing reality amongst the cartels for the most part for a number of years breaks apart. And that's when the Sinaloa cartel decides, we're going to come in and we're going to take Juarez over ourselves. And so I realized I'd forgotten to start my slideshow here. I just want to run these images just to give you a flavor for some of the stuff that I saw while I was on my trips to Juarez. So Juarez explodes in 2008. You have about 1,500 people killed in the city that year. I was just in San Antonio giving a talk yesterday. San Antonio, which is I think about 2 million people, only had 100 murders last year. So that gives you a little gauge of the contrast between what's going on in Juarez and, say, the typical American city. The next year, even more killings year after year. So by the end of 2012, in the city of 1.3 million people, you've got 11,000 people who have been assassinated in the drug war in this one city. I came to Juarez because I wanted to understand what was really going on, what's behind this, but also to try to understand the nature of the relationships between the violence and life in the city. So there are four key characters in my book. One is the mayor of Juarez, a man named Jose Reyes Ferriz, who was mayor between October 2007 and 2010. Another is a photojournalist, a local photojournalist named Raimundo Ruiz, who grew up in a hard-scrabble neighborhood in the city, who is really kind of saved by his art, if you will, because he becomes fascinated with photography, and that allows him, unlike most of the people he grew up with, to find an avenue that takes him out of the gangs and then out of the cartels and the drug business. The third main character is a woman named Elena. It's a pseudonym. She was a mistress for a mid-level cartel, Juarez cartel operative, who ran about 40 to 50 kilos of cocaine every couple of weeks across the river. He was assassinated in 2009. And the fourth main character is a man named Gustavo de la Rosa, a human rights activist who received many death threats because of his work in human rights and sort of defending people whose rights were being violated by the law enforcement and military people in the city. So those are the four people, and I sort of use them as a device, really, to sort of tell the story of what's going on in the city, how it plays out, and also the impact. Because I interviewed a lot of different people in the city. I interviewed parents whose children had been assassinated in cartel-related activity. I interviewed priests who are out working in marginalized communities, trying to help kids not become part of the foot soldiers in the cartels. I interviewed, as I mentioned, a lot of different journalists, people from all walks of life. And my aim, again, was to try to understand the impact of the violence. Because one of the things that people don't grasp, I mean, think about 11,000 people murdered in Austin over the course of 6 years. It's really hard to get a sense for the impact of that kind of violence. There's nobody in that city who's escaped that violence. Everybody has seen people who've been killed. This is a crime scene here. Everybody has seen it directly, has friends and relatives and neighbors who've been directly affected. This stuff happens in all kinds of neighborhoods in the city. It happens in shopping malls, in front of theaters. It happens in broad daylight. This one assassination that you just saw a minute ago happened, right across the street from a school. These various images of Juarez during that time. So what is it like to live in a city like that? And what does it do to kind of a collective psychology? And the truth is that it's really quite a devastating experience. And talking to school teachers, for example, they talk about how all of the kids in the schools are just totally preoccupied about the violence. They draw about the violence. They write about the violence. They play in recess about the violence. They name their pets Sicario, which is the name for a hitman in Mexico. Things of that sort. So the story of what happens in the city is not only, of course, the impact then on the people, but really how did this play out and what happened. And one of the things is that, as I mentioned, that the municipal police were the armed wing of the Juarez cartel. And the Sinaloa cartel made a concerted effort to take over the police. And so what they did is that starting in 2008, they started systematically assassinating police. And they would actually announce who it is. They would list these 17 commanders or these 17 officers are going to be executed because they don't believe that we are here to stay, meaning we, the Sinaloa cartel. And, within 3.5 months, all of those people were either dead or had resigned. In the first year, the city of Juarez lost, something like 50 police to assassinations. Other police were lost. Other police resigned. Other police fled. In fact, by the time the first attempt to clean up the police force happened, about a third of the police is left. A police force of 1,500 people. So eventually they end up having to fire all the police, and the army takes over all police functions in the city. The city becomes basically a city under siege. It's not a declared siege, and doesn't have a curfew that you have to be home by before dark. But basically, the city is run by the military and the federal police, who've come in, about 12,000 of them, and they've set up roadblocks all over the city. Some of these images are of those roadblocks. And so you're seeing a city that's living the sort of the paranoia and the anxiety of this massive violence, with this massive presence of people with weapons all over, and so eventually there are multiple efforts to try to clean up the police, because basically the bottom line is that whoever controls the police controls the city. There have been a reduction of, in 2012, after a peak of about 3,100 killed, less than 800 people were killed in 2012. So a lot of questions as to, okay, what made that possible? And the key variables are, if you go to Juarez, what people will tell you is that the Sinaloa cartel won. And that's the reason that the violence is reduced. That may be a part of the answer. I don't think it's the full answer. I think there are multiple narratives here. One is that one, perhaps. Another is, the Mexican army and federal police took down a lot of people, hundreds of people. The other is that, if you have 11,000 people killed, most of them between the ages of 15 and 25, that's taken a huge toll on the people who were the soldiers in that war. Some people credit the role of the American economic recovery, because the maquiladora industry, the assembly plant industry in Juarez, is about 50% of the economy. And during the peak of the violence in Juarez, that's when the American recession was at its peak. And so in 1 year alone, there were 80,000 jobs lost in Juarez. There was massive unemployment. So that's another variable that economy has picked up. Tax revenues are up. People are going out. People are buying, going to restaurants and stuff like that for the first time in 5 years in the city. And lastly, the Mexican government in 2010 put about $250 million into infrastructure. They built new schools. They did anti-addiction programs, training teachers, and violence, keeping violence out of schools. They did paved roads. They put lighting in communities, and so on. All of that was a result of a massacre that occurred in Juarez, where 16 adolescents were killed, who were students in a city that has the highest school dropout rate in the country. And there was such a national outcry that the Mexican government fast-tracked a program that they had been developing, modeled after the Medellin, Colombia social intervention projects. And so they came into Juarez. They put a lot of money into Juarez, and including after-school programming, because part of the problems in Juarez had to do with the fact that you had schools get out around 1:30. The maquiladoras let their people out at 4:30. You had kids out in neighborhoods that are full of gang activity, with no parents It just that had been going on for generations, you know. So they instituted after-school programs and kind of creating some kind of structure for kids to be someplace where they had things to do and they had supervision and so on. Just a lot of different variables. So you know, I think the biggest flaw in the Mexican government's strategy in the drug cartel war all along has been an absence of an awareness of the social conditions that have created the violence. And so that, the Juarez experiment, it was called Todos Somos Juarez, was the first time in which they actually started responding to those social conditions. And so, you know, Juarez was a city that had tremendous neglect in terms of these things for a long time. There were neighborhoods that had no high school, for example, where kids had, if you wanted to go to high school, you'd have to ride a bus 2 hours each way to get to and from school. Just things of that nature that create conditions that are really highly problematic, not to mention the fact that the maquiladora industry, for example, did not invest in social infrastructure, that they didn't have daycare centers for families. They just, and of course, very low wages. And so you know, the issue of trying to create a community that has some kind of economic dynamism that really addresses or meets the basic needs of families and so on, all of that was highly problematic in Juarez. So I think those are the elements that may explain the significant drop in violence in Juarez to about 800 people last year. And that's about the rate that we're continuing to see this year. Okay. Well, why don't we have some conversation, questions? Yes.
When you were here last time, I remember you explaining something about a policy change such that traffic through Florida was now going through Mexico.
Right.
And I wish you would go over that again because I remember thinking that was very significant.
A really important point. And thank you for asking that question. So what's happened in Mexico, which most people in the United States do not understand, is a direct product of decisions that the United States has made about interdicting drugs and sealing its borders. So 90 to 95% of the cocaine that came into the United States through the early 90s, or certainly through the 80s, came through Florida on ships out of Colombia. The United States, through a variety of strategies, managed to pretty much seal that off. That's when the Colombian cartels started making arrangements with the Mexican cartels to move cocaine through Mexico. That had the effect of making the Mexican cartels extremely powerful. And eventually, I mean, today I would say that the Mexican cartels are more important than the Colombian cartels. The Colombians produce, but the Mexicans really control the market. So that's one thing. And then along the U.S.-Mexico border, the second thing that happened is we did a series of interventions aimed ostensibly at sealing the border, having to do with immigration concerns. But the consequence of that for the drug trade was that the cartels had to shift their business model, whereas historically it was very easy to get large shipments across anywhere along the border. It became much more difficult because of the heightened enforcement along the river and along the whole length of the border. So they started doing this. They started paying their commanders or their lieutenants, they started paying them half in product. So if you were a lieutenant in the Juarez cartel and you were used to, say, making $50,000 a month, and out of that money you paid your people, etc., but you were used to making $50,000 a month in terms of what you were doing, suddenly you were being paid $25,000 and you were being paid $25,000 worth of cocaine. That had a tremendous impact in Mexico because that cocaine that was being paid to these people ended up being part of a domestic retail drug market. Mexico historically has never had a problem with heavy drugs. Mexicans drink maybe a little marijuana, but Mexicans don't do hardcore drugs. That's just not in our background. It's not our culture. It's never been, even in cities like Mexico City or Guadalajara. And for years, Mexico was just a transit point. The cartels were not going to waste a high-profit item on Mexican domestic drug use when just getting that kilo of cocaine across the river doubled its value. But when they started sealing up the borders, what that meant was that all of a sudden you had a lot of cocaine available in Mexico. And so a lot of the violence is related to that domestic drug trade. And so I think that's what you were alluding to. It's really, Juarez, for example, has the highest addiction rates of all of Mexico.
Yes, I just read where OAS, Organization of American States, is considering a proposal to decriminalize marijuana.
Yeah.
I was wondering what impact decriminalization and its limited basis that it's had already in the United States, what impact that's had, and what kind of an impact would the OAS proposal, if it carries, have on the cartels?
Well, I think it'll have some impact, and I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. The problem is that at this point in time, the cartels do a lot of different kind of business, and they run a lot of different drugs. And marijuana is probably their least profit-making product. So think of what it takes to bring 200 kilos of marijuana across the border. And think about the profit margin. You've got to grow that. You've got to feed those crops. Somebody's got to cut it down and create bundles and kilos. It's hard to carry. You see video of people crossing the border in places carrying backpacks full of marijuana. It's not really that efficient when you think about also the profit margin in that work, as opposed to a kilo of cocaine, or as opposed to meth, which the Sinaloa cartel is the leader in Mexico of making methamphetamine. They've been doing that now for just about 4 years, and it's a big profit maker. Things like pharmaceutical prescription medications that are smuggled into the U.S. Those are the big profit margins. Marijuana is a part of the picture, and prior to when all the Colombian cocaine was going into Florida, and the only other drug coming out of Mexico like that was heroin. But marijuana is no longer the big drug for them. It's part of their set of options, And then they're also into other stuff like kidnapping, extortions. So in terms of that, I think it's a step in the right direction. I think it's important. For one thing, what I think is most important about it is that if the United States were to comply with something like that, it would be the first real formal acknowledgement of the role of American consumption in this violence. That's the piece that in the U.S. seems to people don't quite put that together. A couple of years ago I testified before Homeland Security on the drug war in Mexico and its impact. And when I said to these congressmen, I said, look, you all seem to really care a lot about what's going on here. But you go to the FBI's 10 most wanted list. There is not a single drug cartel-related name on that list in terms of America's 10 most wanted list. They had just recently taken down, something like 90 people in the Northeast who were, the FBI had, who were involved in, something related to extortions and strip joints. And, that was all over the newspapers, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's great. But the real scourge and the real scandal is really the extent of this national network. Look, think of what's involved in getting multiple products into every city in America where you have transportation issues, you've got security issues, you've got distribution issues, you've got what to do with the money issues. You've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people involved in this business here in the United States. They are not common names. We don't have any idea who these people are. They are not on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, which is sort of one way of saying this matters to us. That's what I told them when I testified up there, and I still think it's true. It's just not really on our radar.
In February, I had the experience of visiting my brother and sister-in-law in Semul, which is in the Yucatan, which is quite close to Merida. And they live there part of the year and the rest of the year in Denver. And when they started living down there, I said, but is it safe at all to be there? And he said, well, the cartels are all moving their families to Merida. And having been in Merida and meeting some of my brother's friends there, he said it's just growing by leaps and bounds, and the city is becoming more beautiful, and it's because the cartels are there, their families.
Right.
The Yucatan seems to be a very safe place, and is it because of the tourism also? I mean, a lot of Americans go there to see the Mayan ruins and things like that. How much would tourism change some of these other places in Mexico if they would be getting the American dollars?
Well, that's really a great question, because I think there's an enormous misperception in the United States that all of Mexico is unsafe. There are 6 or 7, maybe 8 states or portions of them that are really dangerous. I personally would not go to Tamaulipas. I think it's ungovernable. I think anywhere you go there, anything could happen. Rural Chihuahua, places like that, Nuevo Laredo. They're definitely very dangerous places. But Mexico has 31 states in the federal district. Only about 90 municipalities account for, I don't know the exact number, but really like 80% of the violence out of 2,000 municipalities or something like that. So there's a real distortion in our perception, and it's probably fed by the media that sort of tells us, look, this is a catastrophe everywhere, etc. Places like Merida, Yucatan are fantastic, and Mexico City is the safest it's been in 10 years. I was just there last summer. Fantastic. We're walking home from a restaurant at 2 o'clock in the morning. Mexicans eat late, And it's completely comfortable, safe. Yeah, there's a lot of places like this. And there's a kind of a paradox here, because Mexico for the first time is at risk of dropping out of the top 10 tourist destinations in the world. And so, tourism used to be the second source of income for the country, and so second or third. So that's a huge toll that the violence is taking in terms of perception, which translates into, the UT says you can't go to Mexico on spring break, or the State Department puts out these travel warnings to not go to Mexico during spring break. I think they need to be a little bit more precise in terms of where, because there's definitely places I think you shouldn't go.
Yeah. My name is Phil Hewitt. You mentioned the Medellin, Colombia model.
Right.
Is there any hope that can become more institutionalized in Juarez at various military and government levels? And would that be the training, would that best be done by people from Colombia, as opposed to the gringos coming and trying to do that kind of craziness?
What I know is this, that first of all, that effort in Juarez was unprecedented. $250 million. Some of that money, a lot of that money, from the Inter-American Bank. USAID was involved in that also. So I went down to Mexico and interviewed the people who were responsible for this intervention and asked them, what are you doing with it? What have you learned from Juarez? And how's it being deployed in other parts of Mexico at this point? And what they said is this. One of the things that we've learned is that we need to do more targeted interventions. So like, for example, in Acapulco, they took the lessons from Juarez and they came into specific neighborhoods, not trying to blanket the city. They came into specific neighborhoods. They did sort of pre and post evaluations. They came in and they asked people in the community, what is it your concerns are? What do you need? Et cetera, et cetera. They tried to do a diagnostic evaluation of the needs of the community, but in a much more targeted way rather than a blanket way. That seems to be the main lesson. There's a question as to whether the new administration that just came into office in December, whether they are going to continue with those efforts or not. Peña Nieto is his name, he has said that he's going to continue these social fabric interventions. We'll have to see.
Hi. When I think of Mexico, I think of good, ethical, Christian, Catholic Church people. To what extent is that really true?
One answer could be in the 20s and 30s, Al Capone was probably a devout Catholic, certainly grew up in the Catholic Church, in the Italian mafia were very, so there's always these contradictions, right, between sort of spiritual, religious convictions and what people actually do. That's sort of one part of the answer. So there's probably those contradictions just as much as Mexico as they were in Chicago during that era as they, But I can tell you this, that I interviewed several Catholic priests. One, a very impressive man who was in his early 30s. His church was, the parish had maybe something close to like 50,000 people in the parish. They made visits to every home to try to, very poor neighborhoods where unpaved roads, no running water, no public lighting, horrendous, a lot of unemployment, a lot of family violence, very hard scrabble conditions. This guy, what he did was go into homes, try to learn what people needed, try to connect them to services, try to do training programs for fathers whose wives were the ones who were employed by the maquiladoras and they were unemployed, so they could learn how to psychically manage this change in the culture. Very devoted. I mean, it's impeccable, I would say, I interviewed a Catholic priest who was working in the prison, but I also took pictures of a grand Catholic church that I was told all of the additions to the church had been paid for by one of the big cartel heads. So, life is complex.
Hi, my name is Carol. I'm thinking to go out to Santa Fe and Albuquerque, and I've been there before for a few months. And what I heard from the people there when they spoke the truth was that the El Camino Real, which is the ancient street, or rather road, going from Mexico City straight up to Santa Fe, which is one of the, if not the oldest capital, the oldest one in America. And then now they go straight over to L.A. to distribute the drugs. So this question sort of touches on different things you've touched on. What do you know about that? Because I don't feel safe in Albuquerque or in Santa Fe. And in Trader Joe's, I met a woman who was like 70 or something, lived there 40 years. She said, I feel safer in Mexico than here. Nothing's ever happened to me, she said, but you can feel there's things happening. I teach English. I wanted to go to a small little village just north of Santa Fe, and they said, oh, that's the heroin capital of New Mexico and probably America. You might not be too happy teaching English there. So do you know anything about that?
Yeah. Thanks. Well, here's one question I would ask you. Do you feel safe in Austin, Texas? Well, my point is that there isn't a community in America that doesn't have cartel operatives. That is a community of any size, So any community where you can find somebody who will sell you heroin or sell you cocaine or sell you meth, that community has a cartel presence because either there's a relationship between the local gang that's distributing those drugs in the city. Like Austin is, we had just last year something like 20 La Familia Michoacana people arrested just right here in Round Rock. Just a month or 6 weeks ago, we have a very high-profile federal trial of Zetas, laundering money, right here in Austin. It's all around us. The DEA will tell you that they're in every city. It's no mystery. They're here. They're all around us. And they're around us because there's enough of us who are buying their wares. But they're not interested in shooting you. Well, if they think that you're knocking on doors and or trying to figure out if you're going to report something. But in terms of sort of day-to-day life, it doesn't serve them to have attention brought to them. And violent crime in America is different than violent crime in Mexico. In Mexico, there's complete impunity for any kind of crime. It doesn't matter whether you rob or you rape or you murder somebody. Unless you're caught in the act, the chances of your being investigated, found, and prosecuted are almost zero. They're less than 2%.
Thank you. Regarding Russell's question about the ethics, morality, and your response to that, I might footnote that with this, it's not that these underworld people from Al Capone to what's going on now are without ethics. It's just that they have their own ethics and their own loyalty, and sometimes these ethics and loyalty can be very highly developed, but they're just what in the clinical sense we call it dissocial, D-Y-S-O-C-I-A-L, dissocial personality disorder. But they can be with ethics. It's just that it's their own ethic. Do you agree with that idea? They're not without ethics.
They've got their own rules of how you operate and how you need to behave, and there are consequences if you don't behave the way that they want you to. So,
given the horrific violence that's gone on in Juarez and other parts of Mexico, you've touched on some of these, but I can't even imagine what kind of collective PTSD many people, local people, must have. And did you see the emergence of different types of coping strategies just within the community to try to counteract the effects of the violence?
Well, I think that there's, first of all, that you have to have a certain degree of denial at work, because every time you leave your home, you have to wrestle with the possibility that something horrendous could happen to you or that you might witness something. There's a kind of a peculiar numbing, I think, that takes place also. I've got some pictures, I don't have them on this sequence, but of kids in a school bus coming down a street where there's been an execution. The victim is still laid out in the street. He's surrounded by federal police, masks, and all of this stuff. It's a horrendous, very frightening sight. And these kids were all leaning out the window, flashing victory signs at me and gang signs and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, I got their picture, and you would, if you saw this image, you would never imagine that right behind me is this horrific scene. And to me, that's an example of the coping, a kind of a denial, a kind of like, we'll pretend that this isn't really happening, and that we're just kids who are, these kids all seem to be like 10 to 12 years old, and going home from school, that kind of stuff. I mentioned the principal that I interviewed talking about the impact of the violence in terms of the children's work and the children's play and the things that they drew in class and stuff like that.
Thank you for the presentation today. Early on, you made a comment about something I wasn't aware of, which is Mexico is largely a way station for drugs coming to the U.S. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on that. Is that only for cocaine? Is it for all drugs? What are the relative amounts of is most of the business coke versus other things? and I have no sense in terms of the monetary values involved. Could you, elaborate on any of that?
Sure. Yeah. So what I said about way station was a kind of a comment about a certain historical moment, which was after the U.S. seals off the eastern seaboard, the Colombian cartels make arrangements with the Mexican cartels, and Mexico becomes the throughway to bring Colombian cocaine into the United States. Mexico has always brought its own, these cartels have always brought their own marijuana, their own heroin into the U.S. Those were the three drugs that were kind of players, So two of them, heroin and marijuana, were of Mexican origin. Cocaine was Colombian origin. And cocaine, and the Colombians got out of the marijuana business once the eastern seaboard was sealed up too, because that's where a lot of the Colombian marijuana came in through also. So, but what happens then, the Mexican cartels become the key players, the conduits for this. And what I was saying is that at the time, Mexican domestic drug consumption was minimal. It was limited to marijuana, basically. You couldn't find cocaine. You couldn't go to fancy nightclubs in Mexico City and get cocaine and stuff like that. I'm sure some was available, but it wasn't a common thing. When we start sealing the U.S. border coming from Mexico into the U.S., that creates a sort of change in the business plan, and all of a sudden the Mexican cartels start not just getting drugs across, but started using some of the product in Mexico, and creates huge drug problems in Mexico that didn't exist before. We're talking about 2000 to 2000, from 2000 on. In terms of price, the only drugs I can speak to is cocaine. What I've been told from various sources, including the DEA, is that a kilo of cocaine in Colombia costs you about $3,000. If you get that kilo to Juarez, it costs you about $12,000 to $13,000. So it's 4 times. You get that kilo across the river, and it almost doubles again to about $23,000 to $24,000 a kilo of cocaine. So you can see a kilo is 2.2 pounds. You can imagine that's before they start cutting and doing retail drug sales. So the value of that kilo is, there's a tremendous amount of profit in it. So that's the only drug I can speak to in terms of the economics of the business. But again, I don't know the numbers, but I know that methamphetamines are a huge profit margin drug also. And the Sinaloa cartel was the first cartel to start making meth in Mexico and shipping it into the United States. And my understanding is that now Mexico is the biggest supplier of meth. Meth used to be something that was cooked in rural Arkansas and rural Texas, and it was kind of a poor white boy's drug. And that's no longer the case, or it's now substantively Mexican cartel driven too, because that has a lot of profit in it.
We have time. We have just like 2 minutes left, so if you could give us a quick question and a fairly quick answer. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Margaret Wood, and I'd like to ask you, when you go to Mexico, what do you do to feel a little bit safer?
Well, it depends on where I'm going. When I go to Juarez, I think it's impossible to feel safe in a place like that. When I go to Mexico City, I don't do anything to feel safer. It's just a safer city. Right. Again, when you're working in a city with so much violence and so much paranoia, it's hard not to feel the paranoia yourself. So I have to say that every time I went to Juarez, I felt anxious, and I would stay there for several days at a time. I didn't work out of El Paso. I would land in El Paso, walk across the bridge, get to my hotel, and be there for several days. So during that entire time, I felt the tension, I felt the anxiety, I sometimes had nightmares, whatever, you know. And I could feel, almost physically feel the relief when I crossed back into the United States. Literally, I felt the burden was off. The fact is, I was never threatened in Juarez, and I was in a lot. I would venture to guess I've been to almost every neighborhood in the city, at least driving through it. And so I was never threatened. There were a couple of situations in which somebody I was with said, you know, we better not get out of the car here because these guys look like they're one of the gang members. They're part of the gang that the Juarez cartel runs, and this doesn't look like a good scene. I was also told people were asking me who you are, whatever that means. But nobody ever said you, or I was never left with a note or a threat or anything like that. It's hard to know what's real, what's in your imagination. You see the violence, you know the violence is real. But the violence, you know, I tried to make it clear that I wasn't there to investigate the cartels per se. And that was my cover also. You know, I would say, I'm from the University of Texas. I'm here trying to understand the impact of violence. And they could see, if they were trying to track me, that I was interviewing school teachers, that I was interviewing people in nonprofits working with kids in marginalized communities, that I was interviewing Catholic priests. And, you know, I was doing those interviews. I also interviewed federal police and the mayor and other people that they may have been a little less excited about my talking to.
Where else could we get such an extraordinary inside perspective on a social and economic and political problem? And you're certainly very courageous. Thank you for a wonderful presentation.